Right now, I'd like to introduce Dr. Hayhoe. Hi, Katharine. We're thrilled that you're going to join us today. Dr. Hayhoe is a professor at Texas Tech University and one of the most respected climate scientists of our time. I could take up an entire hour highlighting her awards and accolades, but I'll just give you a taste of her accomplishments. She has a distinction of being not only a high-profile atmospheric scientist, but also a devout Christian, an interesting combination to say the least. That being said, she doesn't accept global warming out faith. She crunches the hard numbers, she analyzes the models, and helps engineers, ecologists, and city managers to evaluate the impact that climate change is having on our planet. As I believe you may already know, she was named one of the Time magazine's 100 most influential people and one of the United Nations Environment Programme's Champion of the Earth. It's pretty clear that Katharine's reputation precedes her appearance here today, since over 1,500 people have registered for her webinar to hear her speak today. Interestingly, in 2005, Katharine was already early on the scene studying California's climate change when she was the lead author on a report for then Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger entitled Public Health-Related Impacts of Climate Change in California. She is also about to release a new book in the next couple of weeks entitled Saving Us, a climate scientist's case for hope and healing in a divided world. And we certainly have a divided world these days. And you will have a chance to pre-order her book at the end of her presentation. So without further ado, Dr. Hayhoe, thanks again for joining us, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Tom. It is such a pleasure to be with you here today. So we are going to be talking to each other. I'm not only talking to you. And how are we going to be doing that? We're doing it through something called PolEV. So there's going to be a link in the chat that you can click on, or you can also go ahead and type it into your computer or your phone. It's POLLEV.com/Katharine. And you have to be sure to spell Katharine correctly with 2 A's. So PolEV.com/Katharine. Check out the chat. The link should be there in the chat as well. If you're listening to this as a recording, I'm sorry, you're not going to be able to do this. You can only do this while we're live right now. And if it asks your name, no need to enter your name. Anonymous is fine. Just click skip. And when you do that on your phone or on your computer at PolEV.com/Katharine, you are going to see a map come up. And what you can do is, just give it a minute here. There we go. You can click where you are joining from. I know that most people are going to be joining from California, but I know that there's also people from all around the world. And if you're not in the US, that's totally fine. Just click off the map in the direction where you are. And we'll assume that you're not in the middle of the ocean, that you're over in that direction. So if you are over in Hawaii or Asia or Australia, click on the left. If you are over in Europe or Africa, click on the right. And it looks like we've got a few Canadians here too. All right. So let's see, mostly California, a big collection around Sacramento, but there's also quite a few all the way down the Central Valley down to San Diego. And then we've got some from Colorado. Looks like I'm the only one from Texas for now. A bunch on the East Coast, some Michiganders, and some up the West Coast as well. All right. So this is how I'm going to be asking you some questions, and it's also how you're going to be asking me questions at the end. So let me ask you, I see everybody's just getting in here. Let me ask you my second question for you. Ready? My second question is this. Who are you? Are you a student, a teacher, a professor, a researcher, somebody who works at a university or school? Are you a member of the Renaissance Society who is sponsoring this talk? Or are you simply an interested community member, just somebody who saw the talk and thought that looks interesting? All right, you can see how fun this is. The polling numbers are going up and down as we speak. So I noticed the students and teachers got off to an early lead, but the community members have now caught up. And it looks like we are at, let's see, about, it's still moving around a little bit. It looks like we're about 43% community members, 23% members of the Renaissance Society. If you're not, if you're one of the 75% who are not, check out their other lectures. They have a lot of really interesting lectures they were just telling me about. Teachers, professors, 20%, students, 15%. Okay, so now you know how this works. And you have to pay attention because every 10 minutes or so, I'm going to be asking you another question. And then at the very end, you are going to be using this to ask me questions. And here's the fun part is you get to upvote the questions that you most want Christy and I to talk about at the end. So stay tuned. All right. So I have, as Tom mentioned, I have a new book coming out in literally just 10 days. Yes, I'm at the point where I'm counting the days. And this is very exciting. I've been working on this book for almost 2 years, and it is called Saving Us. This book was written in response to the 2 biggest questions that I have been getting over the last 3 or 4 years from anyone, anywhere I speak, in North America, in Europe, in Southeast Asia, school kids, young people, senior citizens, faith communities, businesses, you name it. The top 2 questions I get almost everywhere I go are, what gives you hope? And how do I talk about this issue to my parents or my neighbors or my old college roommate or my coworkers or people I know? How do I talk to people about this? Well, it turns out, and we're going to be talking about this today, that climate change is the #1 most politically polarized issue in the entire United States. And we are now in the United States more politically divided than we've ever been in our lifetimes. So if climate change is the most polarized issue there is, if we can come together on that, what else might we fix along the way? That's what my book is about. And here in this talk, I'm going to lay out some of the information, some of the understanding that goes into that. And here we go. As a scientist, I'm going to start with the science. So here's my first question to you that's a little bit harder. This is one where you actually have to try to know the right answer. There is a right answer to this one. How long have we known that humans are causing the planet to warm? Have we known since the 1850s, the 1900s, the 1950s, the 1990s, or since Al Gore made the movie The Inconvenient Truth? How long have we known about this? Well, it looks like the 1850s got off to an early start, but the 1950s are catching up very rapidly. And in fact, the 1950s, don't you feel like this is almost like election night? The 1950s have passed the 1850s. And we've got sort of a lag in there in the middle of the 1900s. I think it's starting to stabilize. Everybody got their votes in. Oh, it's bouncing around a little bit, but I think the 1950s are still in the lead. All right, who's right here? The early birds were right. We have known since the 1850s, that's right, 8, not 9, 1850s, that our planet has a natural blanket of heat-trapping gases that keeps us over 60 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than we would be otherwise. It was Joseph Fourier on the left there who discovered that. In the 1850s, Mrs. Eunice Foote, an amateur scientist from upstate New York, we do not have an actual photograph of her yet. If you Google her name, you will find photographs on the internet, but they are not actually of her, unfortunately. Google sometimes doesn't give you the right information. Mrs. Eunice Foote wrote in a study that she published in 1856 that if carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were higher, the planet's temperature would be warmer, based on her experiments that she did in 1856. And then around the same time, Irish scientist John Tyndall on the right, he actually connected increasing levels of carbon dioxide and methane with coal mining. He connected the dots between fossil fuel use and heat trapping gases in the atmosphere. So we have known since the 1850s that heat trapping gases are the thermostat of the planet. And when they go up, we get warmer. It's like wrapping an extra blanket around the planet. Imagine if you were sleeping in bed at night with the perfect blanket on you and someone snuck in and put an extra blanket on you that you didn't need, you'd wake up sweating. That is exactly what's happening to our planet. Now, today we know that our choices matter. Depending on the choices we make as to where we get our energy and how we use it, we could see our carbon emissions continuing to climb, or we could see them leveling off. The choices are up to us. Now, this is recent scientific information, but when do you think scientists first identified this fact? You know the answer now, the 1800s. It was Svante Arrhenius, a Swedish chemist, who determined that if the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere went up by 50%, which they already have, or if they doubled, or if they tripled, he calculated by hand exactly how much each latitude band on the planet would warm, including the fact that the Arctic would warm twice as fast as the rest of the world. He calculated that in the 1890s. And by the way, his mother's name was Carolina Thunberg, and he is in fact a distant cousin of Greta Thunberg's. It's a small world. So we have known for more than 100 years that heat trapping gases in the atmosphere control the temperature of our planet, that burning coal back then and oil and gas today produces more of these heat trapping gases. That's why the planet is warming and our future is in our hands. We've known this for more than 100 years. By the 1960s, we knew enough to look at the risks of climate change. But even still today, we scientists are still kicking the tires to make sure that we're really sure. So a few years ago, I worked with a number of scientists, including one or two are probably listening on this call, to take 38 different studies and recalculate them from scratch, because those studies found that either climate wasn't changing or humans weren't responsible, as opposed to thousands of studies that showed that they were. We recalculated them from scratch, and you know what we found? We found an error or more in every single paper that if you corrected it, it brought it in line with the scientific consensus. So that's why scientists are 99.9999% sure, and science doesn't get any more sure than that, not only that climate is changing, but that humans truly are responsible. By the 1960s, as I said, scientists were concerned enough about the impacts of changing climate to formally warn a US president of the risks. That president was Lyndon B. Johnson, and that warning was in 1965. Today, the headlines look like this: out of control wildfires, massive record-breaking heat waves, unprecedented melting and ice loss, flooding, and more. As the Prime Minister of Dominica said after his island was devastated by a hurricane several years ago, he said, "To deny climate change is to deny a truth that we have just lived." The question is not, did climate change cause this event? Because we've always had wildfires, hurricanes, heat waves, droughts, floods, and more. The question is, did climate change make it worse? And the answer today is yes. In fact, we can even put numbers on how much worse climate change is making it. The deadly heat waves that the whole West Coast experienced earlier this summer, 150 times more likely because of climate change. Hurricane Harvey that caused over $100 billion worth of damage. 2/3 of that, actually 3/4 of that, was due to climate change. The devastating Australian wildfire season just before COVID. I know it's hard to think back that far, but just before COVID, the headlines were full of the Australian wildfires, 30% more likely because of climate change. Climate change is loading the weather dice against us, increasing the risks that we already face today. It begs the question, now that we know that we've known about it for so long, we've been warning people about it for so long, the headlines are full of its impacts, why are we not treating this thing like an emergency? And I'm going to ask you this question. I want to know what you think. What you can do here is you can put in as many words as you want, but here's the fun part. You can also look at other people's answers and you can upvote them. So go ahead and put in why you think we're not treating climate change like an emergency, and also take a look at other people's answers and vote up the ones that you agree with. Okay, this is good. We've got off to an early lead here. Then politicized is in the top. Profits over people, acknowledging that it will require a behavior change, lack of political will, capitalism inconvenient, greed and fear. I talk a lot about fear in my book. All right. Excellent. Oh, it's all about the money. That one's rising to the top. Yes. All right. So we have a top answer with 49 votes. Oh, 51 votes. Been politicized. Acknowledging it would require behavior change, capitalism, money, capitalism, lack of political will, profits over people, greed, fear, money, profiteering. And oh, I like that one down at the bottom that just popped up again. Oops, it popped up and it disappeared. Let me scroll so we can see it. Too long term, we react to immediate crises. Yes, you're onto something there too. And fossil fuel misinformation, you're totally right. It's not a blank slate. There are people who are actively trying to muddy the waters on this thing. And there's a really good book called Merchants of Doubt. It's also a really good movie if you want to watch a movie this weekend that talks all about the misinformation campaign from the fossil fuel industry. But it's interesting that the number one on this, been politicized, is exactly where I'm going next. All right. So this is Tali Sharot. She's a neuroscientist. She doesn't talk about climate change. She doesn't write about climate change. But her book, The Inconvenient Mind, that explains how our brains work, explains why we're not treating climate change like a 5-star alarm emergency. So in her book, The Inconvenient Truth, or the brain, she talks about how our brains are programmed to get a kick out of information. We like information. But when we give people new information, they typically accept it only if they already believe it. If it contradicts what they believe, their brain shuts off. Another way to put it is, we would like to think that we look for the facts first and we form our opinions second. But in reality, 9 times out of 10, we form our opinions first and then we look for facts that show why we're right. And in today's internet era, we can find them anywhere on YouTube. She goes on to say, this wealth of information available makes us more resistant to change, because it is so easy to find any data, including that the earth is flat, or that masks don't work, or that if you take the vaccine, it's the mark of the beast. Yes, literally, that is something that goes around. It is so easy to find data that supports whatever pre-existing opinion we have. And even worse, as we are exposed to contradictory information and opinions, polarization expands with time as people receive more and more information. So our access to information is part of what is driving polarization. Horrifying and shocking. Dan Kahan is a social scientist who dug into this a little further, specifically as it relates to climate change. He found that people with the highest amount of scientific literacy were not most concerned about climate change. Rather, they were most polarized. And he went on to find, and don't worry, I will translate this into English. He went on to find that being smarter doesn't make you more accepting of science. It just makes you better at what's called motivated reasoning. It makes you better at cherry picking exactly what you need to validate what you already believe. It makes you better at finding the sources and the studies and the YouTube videos that show that you're right. That's what we use our brain power for. Horrifying, isn't it? So where does political polarization come in? Well, back in 1994, in the very distant past, so far back we could hardly remember it, this is what the political landscape of the United States looked like. The median Democrat and the median Republican were closer to each other than they were to the tails of their own parties. And most people were right in the middle. You can see there's hardly anybody at the edges. Most people are in the middle. What has happened over time? Well, 2011, 2017, and then only people who voted in the 2017 election. What's happening? The median Democrat and the median Republican are farther from each other and closer to the tails of their own party. Look at how polarized this is. Both sides are polarized. We often think, well, we stayed here and they moved over there. And then they're like, no, we stayed here and you moved over there. No, both parties moved apart, leaving what? A giant chasm in the middle, into which all kinds of issues are now falling. A study that came out last summer from the Beyond Conflict Institute found that increasingly Americans who identify themselves as either Democrats or Republicans view each other less as fellow citizens and more as enemies who represent a profound threat to their identity. When this mindset develops, the report went on, compromise with the other side is viewed as weakness or betrayal, and their gain is seen as our loss. Doesn't that explain everything about today? So what does this have to do with climate change? Pretty much everything. Dan Kahan went on to develop something that he called ordinary science intelligence. It's kind of like a little score of how well people do at looking at data and statistics and science. It's not, it's not IQ, it's just specifically looking at science in general. And then he asked people, is there solid evidence of recent global warming due mostly to human activity such as burning fossil fuels? Now, I, as a scientist, would answer no to this. Why? Because it's not mostly due to human activities. Without human activities right now, we would be slowly, gradually cooling. Human activities are responsible for all of the warming. According to natural factors, we should be cooling. So I personally, I don't know where I would rank on this percentile here, but I would have answered no. But I don't think that's why most people would answer no. I think most people would answer no because they didn't think it was humans. So what he found here is he found a weak positive correlation between ordinary science intelligence and the chance of saying yes to this question. You can see that the first percentile, they're at about 0.35, so 35% would say yes. And by the time you get to the end, you've got about 60% saying yes. That's not great, from 35 to 60. Then he took this group of people and he divided them into two groups based on what? Not education, not gender, not how much science they knew or studied. He broke them into two groups based on one thing: political affiliation. And here's what he found. He found that the higher the science intelligence of a liberal Democrat, the more likely they were to say yes. But the higher the intelligence of a conservative Republican, the more likely they were to say no. It's got nothing to do with intelligence. It's got everything to do with the fact that the smarter you are, the better you are at out-arguing the devil, so to speak. The smarter you are, the more you can absolutely prove that you're right and everybody else is wrong. And you might say, okay, but this is just the United States, and the United States is a special case. I wish. This is strongest in the United States. This effect is strongest. The signal to noise ratio is largest in the United States, but we see it in other countries too. This study, the first study published in 2016, found that across 56 different countries, what people thought about climate change primarily depended not on their education or their experience, but on their values, their ideologies, their worldview, and their political orientation. In fact, the biggest correlation was with political affiliation. And then the next study that came out just last year found that in rich countries, when people who are politically liberal get more educated, they get more concerned about climate change. But if they're conservative, they don't get as concerned, only in rich countries. In low-income countries, and this relates directly to behavior change, education improves everybody's opinion about climate change. So what's the difference between rich countries and low-income countries? How much we think the solutions are going to affect our personal life. Climate denial has nothing to do with physics. It has nothing to do with the sciencey sounding questions that people trot out, like, isn't it just the sun or volcanoes? If they really had a problem with the basic physics, they wouldn't be using stoves or refrigerators or airplanes either, because it's the same physics. What do people have a problem with? What they perceive to be the solutions. They perceive the solutions to be onerous, to be negative, to lead to loss rather than gain. But if I say, sure, there's a big problem, but I don't want to fix it, then that would make me a bad person, right? So instead, our subconscious comes up with reasons why this can't be real, or those scientists are just making it up, or they haven't looked at natural factors sufficiently. Our subconscious comes up with this, aided with a lot of the misinformation that comes at us every single day in the news and social media, because we don't want to be a bad person. We want to be a good person. And a good person would say, they'd be shrewd. They'd be like, oh, I'm not sure if that's real. Let's wait and see. Let's not change things too quickly. That's what a shrewd person would say. But if you said, sure, it's real, and it disproportionately affects the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world, but I don't want to fix it, that would make us a bad person. And nobody really wants to be a bad person. So instead, due to our solution aversion, we make up these sciencey sounding objections that sound good. They sound like science. They sound like, oh, it's a natural cycle, or, oh, there's too much CO2 in the atmosphere anyways. We sometimes even make up religious-y sounding objections, like, oh, God is in control, so humans can't affect the planet. Or, oh, the world's going to end anyway, so why does it matter? Never mind that in the Bible, for example, chapter 1, book 1, it says God gave humans responsibility over every living thing on this earth. And at the very end of the Bible, it literally says God will destroy those who destroy the earth in the book of Revelation. We make up these sciencey sounding objections or these religious-y sounding objections to cover the real problem, which has nothing to do with science or religion, and it has everything to do with our comfortable lives. We don't want to change. So what else do we know? Here in the United States, pre-COVID, this is what the landscape looked like. The width of the gray bar here shows how polarized an issue is, where you've got Republicans on one side and Democrats on the other. And here, the issues are ranked in order of the width of the gray bar. So the wider the gray bar, the more politically polarized the issue. What issues were at the very top just before COVID? Climate change was number 1. Environmental protection was number 2. And then you had guns, military, immigration, education. Then COVID happened. What do you think happened to this? I have the data. It's in a different order here. So I'm going to use arrows to show you the third, second, and first widest gray bar. Which one's number 3? The coronavirus outbreak. Masks, vaccines, lockdowns. It rapidly became politicized. What's number 2? Race and ethnic inequality. Black Lives Matter. What's number 1? Climate change. Yes, it's still number 1. The number 1 most politically polarized issue in the entire country, ahead of masks, vaccines, COVID, and race and ethnic inequality. See what I mean? If we can come together on climate change, we can come together on anything. So what happens when we see all of this? And when we see what's happening to our world, when we see the wildfires, the hurricanes, the floods, the heat waves, climate changes, and we get worried. How could we not be worried, right? How could we not? So what do? We share more scary data. We say if people aren't acting, they need to act, and I'm going to tell them just how bad it is. But here's what happens. When we dump even more scary data on people who are already skeptical of the issue and trying to find reasons why not to act, they just dig in their heels. Inaction results. As neuroscientist Tali Sharot says, she says, fear and anxiety cause us to withdraw, to freeze, to give up, rather than take action. And that's exactly the opposite of what needs to happen with climate change. We need to advance. We need to activate. We need to never give up. But fear is not going to take us there. It just perpetuates the cycle of climate changing more. How do we break this vicious cycle? I'm convinced through thousands of conversations I've had, many of which are stories that I tell in my book, that when we start by connecting from the heart rather than the head, that's where the solution begins. Rather than talking about polar bears and physics and Antarctic sea ice, we need to talk about the real problems. People don't think it matters to them, and they don't think there's anything positive we can do to fix it. So let's flip this around. What do we need to talk about? We need to talk about how it matters to us and all the positive things we can do to fix it. That's what we need to talk about. We often think that the biggest problem we have are the people who say it isn't real. And they are a large number, but that's not the biggest problem we have. This is the biggest problem we have. We have most people in the US, the majority say, yes, climate is changing. Global warming is real. Okay, that's good. And then you say, is it going to affect plants and animals? And people say, yes, sure. Will it affect future generations? Yeah, it'll affect future generations. What about people who live far away? Yeah, it'll affect people who live far away. Will it affect me? All of a sudden, it drops like a rock. This is the biggest gap we have. Not the gap between people who say it's real and people who say it isn't. The gap between people who say it is and people who think it matters. Because you could say, sure, it's real. And sure, it'll affect plants and animals and people in the future. But if you don't think it affects you, why would you ever do anything about it? This is the biggest gap that we have. The gap between people who say it's real and the gap between people who understand that it matters. Whoops. What is this called? It actually has a name. It's called psychological distance. It's the idea that we humans have a terrible tendency to view things, view risks, serious risks, as being distant in time, the future, not now. Distant in space, over there, not here. Abstract, global average temperature, rather than concrete, wildfire burning down my house. And we view it as irrelevant to our personal concerns. It matters to those tree huggers and to David Attenborough and Jane Goodall and all those environmentalists, but it doesn't matter to me. That's psychological distance. But the reality is, of course it matters to us right here where we live. Wherever you live today, we already see climate and weather disasters happening, and these happen naturally. We get a lot of them in Texas, more than any other state. Wherever we live, it's as if we have a pair of dice and we already have 2 6s on our dice. And if we live in Texas, we already have 3 6s. And we have a chance of rolling those double 6s frequently. A heat wave, a drought, a storm, a wildfire, a hurricane. It's just normal and natural. So where does climate change come in? It comes in by taking one of those numbers and turning it into a 6. Then 10 years later, it sneaks in and takes another number and changes it into a 6. And then it turns another number into a 7. And all of a sudden, we're rolling double 6 after double 6 after double 7. And we're saying, how could this happen? What is going on? That's why I think the best description of what's happening is not global warming. It is global weirding, because the weather is just getting weird. We are seeing massive heat waves and records being broken in Europe and Canada and Death Valley and everywhere in between. We are seeing heavy rainfall increasing because warmer air holds more water vapor. So when a storm comes along today, there's more water vapor for that storm to sweep up and dump on us than there was 50 or 100 years ago. It's happening in China, it's happening in Germany, it's happening in the Midwest and New York, as we just saw last week. It's not only normal storms that are being affected, hurricanes and tropical storms like cyclones and typhoons. They get their energy from warm ocean water. And believe me, the ocean is warming. Over 90% of the extra heat that's being trapped inside the climate system by this blanket of heat trapping gases we're wrapping around our planet, it's going into the ocean. And what is it doing there? It is fueling not more frequent hurricanes. We don't see more frequency. But what we do see is when those things form, they intensify faster, they are bigger, they are stronger, they are slower, and they have a lot more rain. In the case of Hurricane Harvey, 40% more rain. We also know that sea level is rising. And why does this matter? It's affecting us. They're raising the levels of streets in Miami Beach by 2 feet. They've got sunny day flooding in people's garages. They've got property values crashing already along the coast because of sea level rise. These studies, by the way, were done by Zillow, not even by climate scientists. And then, do you remember in February, Texas had a crazy freeze? I was actually here during that time. So when I ask you if you remember, just remember reading about it in the news. Well, we weren't sure. It took scientists until last week, because we like to be very careful. It took until last week to crunch all the numbers and do all the research to confirm that it was a warming Arctic that did it to us. How could the warming Arctic bring a deep freeze to Texas? Well, as the Arctic warms much faster than the rest of the world, and remember, it was Greta Thunberg's cousin who calculated that back in the 1890s, As it warms much faster than the rest of the world, it's affecting the atmospheric circulation in the Arctic. And there's this thing called the polar vortex in the Arctic that when it stretches, that's what kicks off the waviness of the jet stream, which then waves all the way down to Texas and brings this outpouring of cold air, kind of like opening the freezer door. Well, guess what? It turns out that a warmer Arctic is leading to more polar vortex stretching events. So yes, we can even link it with the crazy Texas freeze, which is once again why I don't think calling it global warming makes sense. It's global weirding. Things are just getting weird. And then we've got what you all are familiar with, the apocalyptic wildfires. Now, most of the wildfires in California and the Western US are the result of accidental human ignition. Some are lightning, about 7% are deliberate arson, but most of them are accidental human ignition. Like what? Like power lines sparking, or fireworks at a gender reveal party, or someone leaving an appliance plugged in the shed and it shorts out and burns down their shed and starts a wildfire. These are all real examples. Or even somebody dumping a load of burning trash into the dry brush. Yeah, people actually do that. So climate change didn't start the fires. The fires would have started anyways. So where does climate change come in? Well, remember how I said the hurricanes aren't getting more frequent, but they're getting bigger and stronger because of all that extra energy in the warm ocean water. In the same way, climate change is drying out the soil and the vegetation so that when the fire starts, it's burning greater area and it's much more intense than it would be otherwise. Here's a way to think about it. Imagine you had a pile of fairly green, wet wood and you accidentally drop a match into that pile. What happens? Not much. Might smolder for a little bit. Then imagine you have a pile of bone dry kindling, dry wood, dry leaves, dry twigs, and you accidentally drop a match into that. What happens? It is a conflagration. It goes off and it burns and there's sparks everywhere. That's the difference between with or without climate change. And we're seeing this in the records. I don't know if you've seen this figure, but it is stunning. And of course, it has to be updated this year, right? So this is a figure showing the area burned. That's what each pie is, the area burned by the 20 largest fires in California's history up until the end of last year. Again, we haven't finished this year yet. And when we do, I think we know what this is going to look like. So from 1932, when they first started keeping records, to 1999, there were three of the biggest wildfires. That's the gray area. The blue area is from 2000 to 2019. And the red area is 2020 alone, all by itself. So what we're seeing is we're seeing these wildfires burning greater area. And of course, what happens, that affects us. It affects the air that you breathe and your children breathe. It affects the safety of your home. It affects the economy. It affects every aspect of our lives here and now where we live. So why do we care about climate change? It's because it affects us. It literally affects our water, our food, our security, our economy, our health, our homes. Climate change affects things we already care about. It isn't that we need a new set of priorities to care about climate change. No, whatever is at the top of our priority list today, it's already being affected by climate change. And if we don't think we care about climate change, we simply haven't connected the dots. So now, turning over to you again, I didn't forget. Give me one word. I just want one word. If you have to use two words, put a dot or a dash in between, okay? So if you're going to say polar bear, put like polar dot bear, okay? But I don't expect to see polar bear here. What I do expect to see is things like children, exactly, food, everything, life, biodiversity. Why do you care about climate change? I care about it because, oh, I like this. You can see it's a wordle, right? So the more people say a word, the bigger that word gets. Let's look at the big words that are coming out here. It affects future, life, children, everything. Who doesn't care about the future, about the life, about everything, about children? It is a basic human issue. That's what climate change is. Climate change is an environmental issue, but it's also a food issue. It's also a health issue. It's also an economic issue. Climate change is a human issue. To care about climate change, we only have to be one thing, and that's just a human living on planet Earth, and we're all that. All right. So it's not about the polar bear, because after the polar bear, who's next? We're next. That's us sitting there on that little iceberg, so to speak. We are the ones who are most at risk, along with the polar bear and many other species. We don't somehow float around in outer space as if the planet could go to hell in a handbasket and we'll be fine. No, we live here too. This is where our air comes from that we breathe, our water that we drink, our food that we eat. Everything we have and use comes from this planet. But all of us are not affected equally. This is a map showing where people live in poverty in the world today. The darker brown, the more people live in poverty. This is a map showing who is most vulnerable to the impacts of a changing climate. The poorest people, the 3.5 billion people who have contributed only 10% of the heat trapping gases, they are the ones who are disproportionately affected by the impacts of a changing climate. The very ones who have done the least to cause it, and that is not fair. When a flood happens in North America, it can be devastating. But when a flood happens in Bangladesh, putting a third of the entire country underwater, their harvests are gone, their homes are gone, their lives are gone. When a drought happens in Texas, it can cause $12 billion worth of damage of lost crops. When the same intensity of drought happens in Syria, which is already a failing state with corruption and internal refugee crisis and all kinds of other issues, when that same drought of the same magnitude happens in Syria, that's enough to tip that system over into a massive refugee crisis. Climate change has already increased the gap between the richest and poorest people by as much as 25% since the 1960s. It has already happened. And the United Nations warned just before COVID that climate change threatens to undo the last 50 years of development, global health, and poverty reduction. As the US military calls it, climate change is a threat multiplier. The reason we care about it is because it is the hole in the bucket. What is the bucket? The bucket is whatever you're trying to fix. Poverty, hunger, lack of access to clean water, basic education, gender equity, financial security, access to energy for all, decent work, infrastructure. Whatever we're trying to fix, we're pouring all of our effort and time and money into this bucket. Climate change is the hole in the bucket and is getting bigger and bigger. And if we don't fix that hole, we can't fix anything. That's why climate change matters. We are not faced with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. So when I asked you, why are we not treating climate change like an emergency? All your answers were right, because it is a social crisis, it is a human crisis, it's an economic crisis, and it's an environmental crisis. So what can we do about this? What do we do about this? Here's where you come in. What can I do? Well, often we think the best thing to do is to find the most resistant person we can and go up and argue with them. And so here's Susie, the scientist, and she's got all her IPCC reports, and she is going to convince Calvin, if you remember Calvin and Hobbes, she's going to convince him with all her facts that she is right. Now, based on everything you've learned, do you think this is going to work? No. This is much more likely to dig a trench rather than build a bridge. And if anything, you're going to end the conversation something like this. Why is that? Because often when we think about having conversations, we think about having them with the person who is most resistant. That uncle or cousin or coworker or neighbor or old friend who is most resistant. And chances are, if there's somebody who talks about climate change all the time, if they're always bringing up myths like it's just a natural cycle and those climate scientists are just making it up, and the Green New Deal is a communist plot to destroy America, if they're the type of person who's bringing that up all the time, chances are they are a dismissive. And the one group of people we cannot have a positive conversation with short of a miracle, and I do believe a few miracles do happen, but only very occasionally. The one group we cannot have a decent conversation with are people who just are dismissive. We just can't. Why? Because they literally can't listen. I've tried thousands of times. Believe me, I'm not speaking from inexperience. I have literally tried to have conversations thousands of times with people who are dismissive, and they literally cannot listen. If you give them a link, they cannot click. If you say something, they literally cannot hear the words that are coming out of your mouth. Why? Because they view what you have to say as such an overwhelming threat to their identity that they literally cannot conceive of even letting that information past their ears. That's the bad news. But you know what the good news is? 92% of us are not dismissive. We might be cautious, we might be disengaged or doubtful, we might be concerned, or we might be flat out alarmed, but we're not dismissive. And with people who are not dismissive, we absolutely can have positive, constructive conversations. How? Start not with the science, not with hitting people upside the head with all these volumes of scientific reports. Start with something that you have in common with somebody. What do you share? Connect the dots to how climate change affects what you both already care about. I've started conversations over knitting, over food, over my child. I often think, well, who am I? I'm a scientist. I'm a Canadian. I live in Texas. I enjoy skiing. I'm a mom. I'm a Christian. If you don't know where to start, instead of talking, ask questions and listen. Find out points of connection. Maybe there's somebody who enjoys doing things outdoors and you do too. Maybe there's someone who enjoys traveling to a certain place that you love too. Maybe they're both a parent, or they went to a school in the same area, or you support the same sports team. We care about climate change because of who we already are, and we're all different. So we all have different reasons to care. So here's my last question to you. I care about climate change because I am a what? And I don't want to see the same answers here. I want to see all different answers because you're all different. There's 790 of us on this call, and we are different people. So why do you care? You might care because you're a humanist. You might care because you're a Christian. You might care because you're a mother, an uncle, a father. You might care because of what you do. You're a nurse or a scientist or a philosopher or a naturalist. You might care because of what you enjoy doing, because you enjoy hiking or fishing or being out in nature or skiing, or you're a sledder. I love that. Who we are is the perfect person to care already. Whoever you are, whatever you believe, whatever you enjoy, whatever your passion is, whatever relationships you have, you are already the perfect person to care. And you might care because you're a tree hugger. But does that mean everybody else has to be one? No. They might be a naturalist. They might be a Californian. They might be a lake swimmer. I love that one. They might be an eco-socialist. That's a new one. I don't think I've seen that one before on this one. But whoever you are, you, exactly who you are the perfect person to care about this. And that is what we need to tell everyone else. And I love that human is the one right in the middle there, because you know what? We are all human. Every single one of us is human. So as we finish out, I just have a few more minutes. The questions are now open. So if you have questions, you can put your questions in here, and here's the fun thing. You can upvote the questions you most want Christy and I to get to, because we won't have time for all of them. So I have a couple more minutes of talking, and you can go ahead and start putting your questions in here, and it will stay open, and we will get to these at the end. And you can upvote or downvote the ones that you most want. So first of all, we need to start with bonding over something that we share. And if you don't find something that you share with somebody, then maybe you're not the right person to have that conversation. But we need to explain not only why it matters, but how we can work together to tackle this problem. Because the number one thing that we lack is a sense of efficacy. We feel helpless. Around the world, people feel like I could be doing more, or my country could be doing more, but we don't know what to do. We don't know where to start. We feel a lack of efficacy. People are willing to change if they think that what they do will make a difference. How do we foster a sense of efficacy? By sharing stories about how we are already making that change. So look for stories and share them about what countries are doing, about what corporations are doing. There's actually a lot of good stories about corporations, believe it or not. Share stories about how the fact that we've already got airlines flying on biofuel. Since 2016, United Airlines has been flying on biofuel out of the LA airport. I love talking about what's happening in Texas. We have the biggest army base by area, and it's powered 43% by clean energy. We've got more wind energy than the rest of the country, and we're catching up on solar too. So watch out and get California going. I love talking about the solutions of Project Drawdown, how they include surprising low-tech solutions like biochar and clean cook stoves and educating women and girls and reducing food waste. That's a huge source of emissions. We throw out 50% of the food that we produce while people are going hungry. I love talking about what churches and faith leaders are doing. And just a few days ago, the Orthodox Patriarch, the Pope, and the Archbishop of Canterbury put out a joint notice to listen to the cry of the earth and act on climate change. I love talking about what young people are doing. They are leading the way and showing us that our voices matter. I love talking about what I do. I've got solar panels, I have a plug-in car, reduce our food waste, changed all my light bulbs, eat more plant-based food. We can absolutely talk about what we're doing too. I love talking about how the world is changing, how clean energy is revolutionizing energy poverty in some of the poorest places in the world. Last year during COVID, 90% of new energy installed around the world was clean energy. Is that not good news? It absolutely is. So what do we have to do? Where do we start? By doing one thing that we're not doing. Remember this map I showed you where we asked, do we think it matters to me? And it was dark blue. There's a darker blue map. You know what it is? Do you ever talk about it? We're not talking about it. And if you don't talk about it, why would you care? And if you don't care, why would you ever do anything about it? So that's why when I did a TED Talk, which you can watch, and they'll put a link in the chat there, I said the most important thing we can do to begin is talk about it. We're not talking about it. Yet talking about it knocks over the first domino. That's what talking about it does. It knocks over that first domino that leads to system-wide change. Climate changes, we get worried, and here's where we break the cycle. Talk about how it affects us, where we live, and positive, constructive solutions. People feel empowered. Action results. And what neuroscience tells us is this. Our brain is literally built to associate forward action with a reward, not avoiding harm. So reframe your message so that the information you provide induces hope, not dread. Hope, not dread. When we talk about it, we change who we are. We change what people around us think. We change our social norms. We alter our sense of efficacy, and we ultimately change our ability and our willingness to act. And where do you come in? Right here. The IPCC report came out a couple of months ago, and I was asked to write an essay for Time magazine about it. And so I dug deep. I said, what can I say about this dire code red report? How has the world changed before? How have people responded to threats? By doing what we're not doing yet, which is using our voices to advocate for change. In this essay, I wrote this, and this is just the conclusion. Where do we find our hope? We find it in action. The world has changed before, and when it did, it was not because a president, a prime minister, a CEO, or a celebrity decided it had to. Change didn't begin with the King of England deciding to end slavery, or the President of the United States giving women the vote, or the National Party of South Africa opting to end apartheid. It began when ordinary people of no particular power, wealth, or fame, decided that the world could and should be different. Who were William Wilberforce, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, and all the countless others who shared and supported and fought for their vision of a better world? They were people who had the courage of their convictions, who used their voices to advocate for the systematic social changes that we need. We are the people who have changed the world before, and we are the people who can change it again. And that's why when I wrote my book, I called it Saving Us, because I know the power of a conversation. This is Glenn, and he watched my TED Talk. And within 5 months, he had had 10,000 conversations in his small town about climate change. And their city council had voted to devote 20 million pounds to a climate adaptation and resilience strategy. And it all began with a single man and a single conversation. That is the power of change. And that is why I truly believe that it's up to us to save us. Thank you.
That was just awesome, Katharine. That was a totally new approach to understanding this problem, situation, opportunity than I've ever heard before, and I'm sure many others would agree as well too. The questions have started to come in. What I'm seeing most of all, the majority of people are asking, how can I make a difference? What specific actions are best to quickly reduce the problems that we face and make a difference?
Yes. So I've sort of answered that, but let me answer it a different way. Did you know that 2/3 of heat trapping gas emissions since the dawn of the industrial era were produced by 90 companies? 90 corporations produce 2/3 of greenhouse gas emissions.
Oh my goodness.
And did you know that some of those same companies, like British Petroleum and Shell, have not only invested in muddying the waters and confusing us and putting out misinformation, but even today, they are investing in social media campaigns asking, what are you doing to cut your carbon footprint? Are you changing your light bulbs? Are you getting an electric car? Do you have solar panels on your roof? They are literally taking the idea of our personal carbon footprint and they are trying to shift the responsibility onto our shoulders. Now, don't get me wrong. I have solar panels. I have an electric car. I reduce my food waste. I've completely changed the way that I travel. I've changed the way that we eat. Is that enough to fix climate change if all of us who are alarmed and concerned did it? No. If all of us who are alarmed and concerned changed all the personal habits that were within our power where we live, in our home, not our place of work, just our home, our personal lives, that would reduce maybe at most 20% of the emissions, 20%. So then you might say, well, that feels hopeless. Shouldn't we just, pull the blanket up over my head and go back to sleep? No, because that shows how our personal actions are important, but they're important because of how they can affect others. When you do something, tell people about it. When you want change, have a conversation in your place of work or your school, your place of worship, your neighborhood, your city. Use your voice to advocate for change. Talk about not just how you can change how you travel, but how everybody at your organization can change how they travel. Talk not just about where you're getting the energy to power your home, but where your entire business could get the energy to power their productions. Why do you think Amazon is changing the way it gets its energy? Why do you think Facebook's investing in clean energy? Why does Microsoft have a net zero carbon goal? It was because people who work there, whose names we don't even know, raised those issues within their place of work and said, we need to change. The world has changed before, and it's changed because people decided it had to. But it wasn't just because people only change things in their personal lives. It was because people use the most powerful thing they have, which is their voice. And that's exactly what our children are using today. They are using their voices to advocate for change. And that is the only thing that's ever changed the world before. And that is what's going to change the world again. And let me just give you one little example. About 5 or 6 years ago, there was a young teenager who was so anxious about climate change, she was pretty much having panic attacks, as some of my own students are. So she convinced her family to stop flying, to change their diet, to change the way they live, to cut their carbon emissions to almost nothing. And they did. But if that was the only thing that they had done, no one would know her name. But instead, everybody knows her name. And the reason why everybody knows her name is because she did one more thing. She took a piece of white cardboard and she wrote a few simple words on it, School Strike for Climate, and she went and she sat outside a building. She used her voice, and that is how she is changing the world. And of course, her name is Greta, but you know what? If she can do it, can't we?
Okay, so what about politicians? Do we even get to bother to try to change them or to make them aware, or is that too big? I'm hearing you just say everything is local and deal with the community I'm in. Can we expand it to be something big, make the decisions?
Absolutely. So did you know that in the US, 99.9% of elected officials are not federal? So there's people who work on the school board, the city council, the county. There are so many elected officials that can make decisions. They can make decisions for the city, for the county, for the school, for the surrounding area. And absolutely, we live in a democratic society. They need to hear from their constituents. And often it's a lot easier to get in to talk to somebody at the city level or the state level than it is at the federal level, right? And I'm not saying don't talk to people at the federal level either. But if you're a little bit nervous about it, there's a great organization called Citizens Climate Lobby. And I'm sure some people listening are part of Citizens Climate Lobby. And they are all about having respectful, positive, constructive conversations with elected officials at every level. So if you're feeling like I would like to talk to my elected officials, but I'm just not sure about this whole thing, check out Citizens Climate Lobby. They've got a chapter near you, I guarantee it. And they will take you together with a group. They'll train you. They'll show you how to do it. They'll make the connections so that you can go in and you can use your voice. Because like I just said, we live in a democratic society. And part of that is using our voice to tell our elected leaders, no matter what party they're from, that a thermometer is not Democrat or Republican, that a wildfire does not stop to ask who you voted for president before it burns down your house, that the smoke that chokes your children's lungs does not affect them differently depending on whether you call yourself conservative or liberal, that this matters to every single one of us, and whoever that politician is, this is something that matters to their district.
So all politics is local, as the old adage goes, for the most part. So somebody's asked, or many people have asked, how do you personally cope with the feelings of climate anxiety and the climate scientist, this person is saying, I often feel exhausted. I'm guessing given these presentations helps you, but don't you get a little despondent at times?
I definitely do. And again, the reason I wrote this book, Saving Us, is because that's the number one question I get. That is the number one question, because when we look at what's happening, how can we not feel discouraged and despondent? I did a little experiment the other day where I went to CNN and they had 35 headlines. And I counted those headlines. About 7 or 8 were neutral. They were just sort of factual. And all the rest were negative. All of the rest of them were negative. So if we just sit there and wait for hopeful information to come to us, it won't. So what do we have to do? And this is actually the end of the book. We have to go out and look for it. We have to actively look for reasons for hope. When we act, when we look at others acting, when we hear stories about others acting, when we join together with like-minded people who are all acting together, that's where we find the hope. The action comes first, and then the hope follows. And especially seek out a group of people who shares your values. They may share your faith, they may share your interests, they may share, you're both parents or you live in the same place. I'm part of an organization called Science Moms, for moms who care about climate change. I also advise young evangelicals for climate action, for young Christians who care about climate change. There's groups for green Muslims. There's groups for people who hunt and people who fish and people who hike and people who enjoy winter sports. Find a group of people who shares your values and your priorities, join together with them to be encouraged by them and to encourage others in turn, and together to use your voice to advocate for change. And if you're interested in more, I would ask, if you don't mind, please consider buying the book. Because if you pre-order the book, and you can only pre-order it for 9 more days, if you pre-order the book, you can actually submit your proof of purchase and get a hand-signed book plate. Yes, I'm actually hand-signing book plates, but only if you pre-order. So I will find the link. I'll drop the link in the chat, and the host can put it in the chat. Oh yeah, I can send it to everybody. And if you pre-order the book in the next 9 days and submit your proof, you can get a little signed book plate. And here's the thing. All the pre-orders count for the first week of sales. And it's the first week of sales that determines whether a book gets on one of those lists. And if a book gets on a list, that means that millions of people will see a book about climate change who normally ever wouldn't. And they'll be like, climate change, that's interesting. Maybe I should check it out. And who knows how many new conversations we could have because of that. So we can all do something to get the word out. And in the book, I have all kinds of stories. If you're like, how do I start the conversation? Just be like, oh, there's a really cool story. Maybe I should just tell that story to somebody. And then we can have that conversation, start the conversation and ask people, what do they think? Why does it matter? And what can we do to help fix it?
And the title, Katharine?
The title of the book is Saving Us, a Climate Scientist's Case for Hope and Healing in a Divided World. I'll put the link to the book in here first, and you can order it from any bookstore you want, as well as an ebook or an Audible. And then I'll also put the link to where if you buy the book, you can submit the proof and you can get a free hand-signed book plate.
Okay. So a number of
people
people
are recovering.
A number of people have asked this question or are voting for this question. Is there any way forward without addressing our current system of animal agriculture?
So you know how I said that 90 fossil fuel companies were responsible for 2/3 of our heat trapping gas emissions since the dawn of the industrial era? Well, 25 industrial meat and dairy companies are responsible for 50% of our agricultural emissions. 25 companies. So all told, animal agriculture is responsible for 14% of emissions. Deforestation and land use is responsible for 11%, but a lot of that is related to agriculture too. And then fossil fuels are responsible for 75%. Ultimately, we have to get to carbon neutral. We have to get to where our emissions equal how much we're taking up. So we have to deal with fossil fuels, but we have to deal with agriculture too. And with agriculture, again, remember, 25 companies. They're the big ones. How can we affect those companies as consumers? By not buying their products, by sending them a message, maybe saying, I like your product, but I can't buy it right now because you're one of the top emitters. What are you doing? I would love to hear what you're doing. There's carrots and sticks, right? Tell me what you're doing to help. By eating differently, but by encouraging others too to be part of the solution, to recognize that it really does make a difference. What we eat, how we live, where we get our energy, it all comes together. And you don't have to feel like it's a new set of green 10 commandments. No, we are ultimately, individually, we are not the ones who put this problem into place. We're the ones who are living the consequences of this problem. But each of us has a role to play. And our role is not burying our head in the sand like an ostrich. Our role is to use our voice to advocate for a better future for every single one of us.
Okay, so here's an interesting question that's come up. Why is the accelerated warming of the Tibetan Plateau leading to major Asian rivers becoming seasonal by 2050 not being talked about in the West?
It's because we talk about what's happening in the places where we live. Let me give you an example. Hurricane Irma hit just the other day. It hit Louisiana. And I was surprised because I got hardly any news calls. But then the flooding hit New York, where all the media lives, and the news calls came flooding in. Why? Because their basements were being flooded. It is just naturally human to talk about what is happening in the places where we live. And here's the thing. Research has shown that when we make climate impacts local, when we talk about what's happening in the Midwest, if we live in the Midwest, when we talk about what's happening in India, if we live in India, when we talk about what's happening in Texas, if we live in Texas, that not only does it increase our awareness of the risks of climate change because we don't see it as far away anymore, not only does it do that, but it also cuts down on the polarization. Isn't that amazing? It actually reduces our polarization when we bring it locally. So should we be talking about what's happening in the Tibetan Plateau? Absolutely. But where's the most powerful place to do that? With people who are being directly affected by it. Because if you talk about it over where people aren't being directly affected, it perpetuates the idea that it's happening over there. And most people agree it's happening over there. But if it's happening over there, why should I do something about it? We need to see, unfortunately, this is just the way our psychology works. We need to see what's happening here where we live in order to understand that we need to act.
Great. So here's one last question then. How much better is biofuel?
How much
better is biofuel?
Well, the answer is that it depends. And just a second here. I'm just going to I put the link in the chat about the fossil fuel companies, and then I'm just going to put the link in the chat about the meat and dairy companies too. Here we go. Here's the link to that. Okay. Biofuels can be done well or not. Sometimes biofuels, if you grow the crops for them and you put all these fossil fuels into growing the crops and then you turn the crops into biofuel, your emissions are actually higher than if you just use the fossil fuels. But in the book, I actually talk about this. If you take agricultural waste, products that people wouldn't use, if you take old used cooking oil, like from restaurants, literally like KFC, if you take products that are not going to be used, that are just waste products, you can turn those into biofuels. And then there's a net benefit because those plants sucked the carbon out of the atmosphere just recently. So if you put it back in, it's carbon neutral. So in the book, I talk about a company called REG that's based in Ames, Iowa, that my friend went to work for. And he told me he was going to work for a biofuel company. I was like, biofuels, aren't those a boondoggle? And he's like, not the way we do it. You should come visit. So I did. And I learned that if you do it the right way, it really does work. It's not good. There's no magic silver bullet that's going to fix everything. But biofuels are a great way to replace liquid fuels in things like trucks and buses until they can be electrified. And then I asked the engineers there, I said, well, what happens when we have electric buses and trucks everywhere? They said, well, then we'll turn to airplane fuel because that can't be electrified because the batteries are too heavy. So there are many solutions. There's no one silver bullet, but there's a lot of silver buckshot, so to speak. And if you want more information on that, Project Drawdown is a fantastic resource. It's drawdown.org, and it has over 100 different solutions that you can read about. And then what do you do after you've read about them? You can
talk to other people.
Yes, tell people about them.
Okay.
That is the most important thing to do.
Well, your enthusiasm is absolutely infectious as well as incredibly informative, Katharine. So much. We are so grateful, and a great kickoff to our next semester of Renaissance Society. And I'll turn it back over to Tom at this point.
Well, thanks, Christy. Fantastic, Katharine. Thank you for a really fascinating and provocative presentation about the current state of our climate change and how each of us, no matter what our affiliations, religious or otherwise, we need to be stewards of our fragile planet. But I'm going to reflect back on one of your answers to one of the questions. I mean, speaking of elected officials, actually, your presentation could not have occurred in a more opportune time. Just 2 days ago, Sacramento County just released its final public review draft for their long-awaited climate action plan with a 30-day window to receive input from the public. Now, talk about being an advocate for change and acting together. This is what our citizens locally can do. So we're going to be sending out to our listeners a follow-on email to let them know how they can participate in this process and be an advocate for change. So, but first, I'd like to share some of our slides with you and tell you a few things about Renaissance. So, Renaissance Society is a very philanthropic organization. Each year we provide substantial, financial support to Sac State University's scholarship program and promote contributions to the Associated Students Food Pantry program for students in need. For each forum speaker that we have, we also make a financial donation to the Seth Nelson Student Emergency Grant Fund, which assists students who experience an immediate financial emergency. And finally, Dr. Hayhoe, for you, as a token of our appreciation for your great presentation today, we are also awarding you a 1-year honorary membership to the Renaissance Society, so you can also experience for yourself some of the fantastic array of diverse classes that some of which you've seen the titles for, and other high-profile weekly forums with a similar format to yours. And the next slide will show us your book. Here we are. Before we finish up, here's your great book, which will be available in the next week or two, as you said. And for those of you who would like to pre-order her book, simply return to your Eventbrite registration page or any of the Eventbrite emails you received and choose the link that says pre-order her book. Simple as that. I encourage you to do so. It is a great book. And last but not least, I would be remiss if I did not also thank all of the sponsors and co-sponsors who helped develop and make this event so successful. The 6 sponsoring organizations on the top and the right-hand side were the primary organizers, and the co-sponsors on the left also help promote our organizations, help promote over 70 environmental, faith-based, educational, and media organizations that went out of their way to sign up the over 1,600 people who registered for this presentation today. All right. Again, presentation was recorded and it's archived, and you can find it on the forum YouTube channel or directly from the Renaissance website. Finally, Next Friday, we will hear about another fascinating topic from Professor Lisa Ikemoto, selling genes and buying race. Her research focuses on the ways that race and gender mediate access to and impact biomedical technology and healthcare. Her projects include tracking the formation of markets for human cells, tissues, and DNA, and her recent work addresses reproductive tourism and the ways in which human gamete use links the industries of fertility and biotechnology. Thank you again for a fantastic presentation, and we'll all look forward to having those other people who want to see it have availability, because it'll be recorded and it's archived. Thank you again, Katharine.
Thank you, Tom. And you're going to be sharing the links that were in the chat. I know a lot of people were asking about those links. You're going to be sharing them as in a follow-up, right? Where can people find those links after the recording?